first on the docket? Oh, there we go. Thanks for starting the recording. Is it the minutes we want to take care of first?
That's right.
Great. All right. Well, I'm happy for anyone who's had a chance to read those minutes. If they look good, go ahead and make a motion.
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes, please.
Very
I'll
good.
second it.
Second by, who was that?
Michael, I'll second it.
Michael, thank you. Okay, so a motion by Wally, second by Michael. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Anyone opposed? Okay, sounds like we are all ayes. Very, very good. Thank you. The minutes are approved. All right, I'm still pulling up the agenda. So what do we have next, Matt?
I believe the next item of the agenda is to introduce Lisa Banoves. Did I get it? Yeah, we have been in contact with her about a proposal to do our strategic planning facilitation. So we have been very pleased with the conversations that we've had with her. She submitted a proposal that we distributed, I believe it was last week, maybe a little bit earlier than that. And so I hope everyone's had a chance to look through that, but if not, I'm sure she can give us a brief summary of that. And also, Lisa, if you wouldn't mind just giving some of your background, brief bio, if you would, I think that would be helpful too.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. And it's a pleasure to be on Zoom with you all. As Matt said, I am Lisa Banoves, and I work for the Center for Court Innovation. I'm an attorney by training, actually started my legal career as a public defender in upstate New York. But the last almost decade have really worked with systems, thinking through the challenges that they face. And it's spent a good period of the last 3 to 4 years doing strategic planning specifically, and generally across system actors are sometimes focused on one actor. My colleague and I run a department called Research Practice Strategies. I'm the practitioner, the lawyer, and she is the researcher. And we do our work informed by both aspects of skill sets and specialties in order to make the most informed decisions available to those systems that we're working with. So we are slightly familiar with Utah because some of our colleagues worked with IDC a few years ago on some internal strategic planning just for IDC staff. Some of you all might have been on the commission when they were out there in Utah and met them. But really when Matt came to me, this was more big picture commission strategic planning. Where do you all see the commission going in the next 3 to 5 years? The proposal that I shared gave 2 different options for you all to consider, depending on what your needs are, your schedules are, how much time you want to engage with this process. The first one's a little bit longer. It's about a 6-month process, and we do a lot of preparatory work before we get out there so that we've met you all, understand on an individualized basis where you're at and thinking through how you see the commission moving forward. Through all that, we synthesize that information and really have it inform the strategic planning that we'll do when we come out to Utah on site with you all. We did write in the proposal that it would be 2 half-day sessions. We can certainly tailor that. All of this we can tailor to what your needs are. And through being out there with you on site together, thinking through all the different priority areas that you might have and how you're going to choose what comes first and what comes second, we'll then create a strategic plan. That strategic plan will do a lot of iterative process with you back and forth of, does this meet your needs? We don't have a cookie cutter. We don't have a specific template where we say, this is what you'll get. Rather, we'll say, what are your needs? As a commission, would you like a narrative strategic plan that is printable that you can have on your desktop? Or do you want something that's workable, virtual, multiple people can input new information and update it all the time? And it really depends on the folks on the ground, what it looks like, so that it's a usable document and a usable strategy for you all. I feel like I gave that all very quick, and I'm happy to go into any more details if you want to know any more information about myself. But I do love working with systems. We work with states all across the country. I'm doing some strategic planning in Georgia next month, where we did this whole preparatory process. And now we're going on site to do that really targeted work of where do we go next. And if you are amazingly a group of folks who all agree on everything, you'll be the easiest site I've ever worked with.
Well.
Have you heard the comment, trying to herd cats? That's what you're looking at.
I'm sorry, Sam, I couldn't hear that, what you said.
The comment, trying to herd cats, that's what you're looking at, okay? We're all just being polite, not making any comments. I got to think about what you just said. I don't know whether a working document is what we need, or whether one that lays out what, you know, our strategic plan is going to be. But if it's thinking into the future, to me, that would imply a working document that could be amended as things develop.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it, though.
Yeah, and you wouldn't have to make any of those decisions without us asking the questions that get you to where you need to be. That's our job, to make sure we're asking the right questions to get you all the most satisfactory process.
A question that comes up for me is how, I guess, the interplay between a long-term strategic plan and what the legislature doesn't do, what we want them to do. Would this include, I suppose it would include a legislative agenda to some degree for us.
Yeah, we would have to plan for all of that. Do you need contingencies based on different avenues that the legislature may go? What would that look like? How would we make that part of your plan? All of that would come into this process. And that's really why we don't have something that's cookie cutter, because every site that I work with has those different pieces that are integral to their process.
Yeah, I think what Sam says makes sense to me, is that you do want a document that we could keep returning to and modifying.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we're just, it seems to me, and we have done this in the past, is just kind of serendipity.
Well, most of what we have been doing for years is reactive.
Right.
To what the legislature does and imposes on us. This could give us some idea going forward to be thinking out, you know, is it a 5-year plan? Is it a 10-year plan? What is it that we're looking at? And that gives more room for growth as you develop it. Michael, you're here, Michael Dressler. The court has a 5-year plan and a 10-year plan. And, you know, that's, you keep getting input into it every year as things develop. That's what makes sense to me. But anyway.
Yeah, and I think what is incredibly helpful about option one is to having individual interviews with you all to learn all of that information before we come out on site, and being able to get that documentation in advance, review all of it, know where the best next steps might be even before we're on site together.
Yep.
And just as a way of background as well, and I think we included this in our materials, all my colleague and I do is criminal legal systems. So this is our shop. This is what we do. This is where our brain is at all the time. Oh, sorry,
Yes,
somebody.
As we work with you, will your enthusiasm rub off on all of us?
100%. And my colleague, by the way, has been nicknamed Scrappy because she's got that little energy that just seems to get the room jazzed up. So you will love her.
Where upstate are you?
I'm in Syracuse.
Yeah, baby. I went to Jamesville, Dewitt. That's where I'm from.
Come on now. That's
Oh, yeah.
amazing. Yeah, I'm right on the DeWitt border.
And my son is working for a federal magistrate in Ithaca, but for the last year before he started working for the federal magistrate, he worked for the Onondaga appellate division, public defender appellate division. And because of COVID, I was able to watch him argue a number of cases before, I forget which court of appeal, if it's the middle court. I'm sure it wasn't the highest court, but I got to watch him live argue cases in front of the appellate court.
Wally,
Small world.
magistrate judge.
Say it again.
Who's the magistrate judge?
It's a woman, and I don't remember her name. It's a hyphenated name.
Okay.
Do you?
Did the apple fall close to the tree, Wally?
It
No.
did. It did. He's waving at windmills too.
Well, can you all hear me now? Okay. I'm having to use both my devices and use my phone for the sound, it looks like. But I think I've worked it out, and what a good discussion. And Lisa, thank you for coming and sharing with us your background. And this is something that the entire group has very much been looking forward to. So Matt, is there anything else we need to proceed, or is there any other comment in the moment from a commissioner?
I already feel very enthusiastic.
If there's no other comments, I think the only thing that we would need to decide, first of all, I would say that as staff, we have already set aside some in the budget for the strategic planning. So I don't have any concerns about that. And so then we would just need to know if the commission wants to go forward, and then which of the two options we want to do, whether it's the 6 month more involved with the upfront interviews, or a shorter 4 month period.
Do you have a recommendation, Matt?
I think I would go with the 6 month recommendation. I think it would be really valuable just to get everybody's input before we proceed. I think that, we as staff have our own ideas and thoughts, but those might not align perfectly with the commission, and it would be important to have everybody's input in there.
Do you need a motion?
I think so.
So I would make a motion that we move forward with the 6 month plan.
I second that.
A motion by Wally and a second by Sam. Any further discussion by commissioners?
I think it will require a trip to Syracuse, don't you, Lisa?
Oh, perfect. You guys are all going to come to me. I thought I was coming all to you.
We don't have that in the budget, Wally. I'm
I would
sorry.
like to see the justification to the legislature for that.
Wally's paying, maybe. We all get to stay at his place. Okay, good. Sounds like we have a motion for the 6 month option, and let's go ahead and take a vote then. All in favor to
Aye.
go about it that way? Yes, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Very good. Any opposing? Okay, we are unanimous. Very good. Thank you so much, Matt, bringing that to us, and Lisa for being with us today. I don't know if Lisa stays on. Is that part of it?
I think I was going to pop off after that, but if there was another piece you thought it'd be helpful for me to stay on for, I'm more than happy to.
I don't think so. The more you're with us, the more you're going to find out about all the cats. We have plenty of pretty awesome people in this group, I'm going to say. So, but we look forward to
I will.
it.
Yeah, I will be in touch with Matt and start the planning process of timeline and where we go from here.
That sounds
Great.
really good. Very good to meet you. Thank you, Lisa.
You too. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Looks like staff has the next point on the agenda.
Yeah, well, thanks, everybody. First of all, thanks for the vote on this strategic planning. That's really exciting. I'm really excited to work with Lisa. I think she's a great fit for the IDC and the commission. So we're going to do it. If we could start the presentation. So here we are, all this planning. We're here for the grant award review and recommendations. Thought we'd start with just kind of a review of the process, brief review of the process that we took to get here, that y'all were involved in. Next slide, please. And first off, we wanted to clear up one thing or address one matter. As you know, we did get some funding to run a pilot program with the Parental Defense Representation Program. We received $170,000 appropriated for that. And I'm going to pitch this over to Adam briefly just to give an update on that. We are not quite ready to make recommendations on this particular piece of the funding, but we wanted to give you an update as to what we've heard from our funding partners.
Thanks, Matt. As Matt said, we did keep this process as part of our regular application and review process, but also recognize that it is a bit different than the rest of what we're doing. This is a pilot program with specific requirements designated by the legislature. And consequently, we feel like we need to dig in a little bit more to what the systems who've made the requests are anticipating that the workers will do, find out whether they understand there's going to be oversight requirements from the managing public defenders, and just be clear a little bit more on why they're asking for the amounts they want also, in addition to those other points. So we have the applications. As it shows here, we got a little bit more requests than we have funding for, but we can deal with that in a couple of different ways. In any case, we will do some more research. I will share what the parameters are, the plans with the different systems, and then staff will get together and bring recommendations back to the full commission at a meeting either in June or soon thereafter. We will be, this is ongoing funding, so we'll ask everybody to get started as soon as possible on their hires. So it should be able to move forward pretty quickly after the approval from the commission of whoever they want to give the grant funding to. So we've identified these items, but we won't be including them as part of the request for approval today.
Good, that's helpful.
So with that, going back to the history of the process of how we got to these recommendations that we're bringing to you today, we did do a series of collaborative meetings with each system throughout the course of the spring. And I'm going to ask Leslie now to talk about those and what we brought to those discussions and how we collaborated with the systems. Some of you were involved in these meetings to reach the recommendations that we got.
Definitely. So we've talked about this a little bit before, but to review, every 6 months, every system has to fill out the system needs evaluation and the caseload survey. And both of those help us understand what the needs of each system are, what their caseloads look like, how they're complying with core principles, all that good stuff. And so if the system needs evaluation showed the systems were not complying with core principles, we recommended funding items, grant items that would help them get to that core compliance. So for example, how do we reduce managing defender caseload so that managing defenders can actually complete their recommended responsibilities? The caseload survey is filled out by every single attorney who has a contract with the system. And that's what we use to determine the attorney deficit. So we recommended the number of full-time equivalent attorneys to bring each system up to those 1973 NAC standards, which we're accepting as our absolute minimum baseline. RAND, other standards suggest that even more attorneys are needed, but so many systems are below this absolute minimum that that's our priority. And so to explain that a little bit, this next slide gives an example of how we calculated some of these things. So in Weber, the caseload survey showed that there were 20 attorneys, 20 different contracts, working a total of 710 attorney hours per week. That's 9.5, the equivalent of 9.5 full-time district attorneys, 2.3 juvenile delinquency, and 5.8 parental defense. I think I made one spelling error here, or there, it should be 1.3 juvenile delinquency, I believe. But so then looking at Weber County's caseload, looking at the 1973 standards, we would recommend 12.2 district attorneys. So that means they have a deficit of 2.7 FTEs. And we did that for all district courts, all juvenile delinquency courts, all parental defense courts throughout every system. We calculated this deficit, and that's how we got to our recommendations and what we recommended they apply for funding items. Just to note again how minimum baseline these 1973 standards are, the RAND standard would show a deficit of 40 district court attorneys. So 2.7 is nothing compared to the high end of what we could be recommending. I also want to note parental defense standards get a little harder. There just aren't good national ones. And so this is based on kind of discussions. Pam, hit me.
When you say 12.2 district attorneys, that's like defense district, not district attorneys, like county.
Oh, sorry.
attorneys.
No, district court.
Yes, okay, gotcha.
Defenders.
Roger.
Yep. Mike Drexel.
Hi, Leslie. I was going to ask if the RAND standard were the operative standard and we were trying to get to the, correct that deficit of 40 attorneys, how would that stack up with the number of defense attorneys compared to the number of prosecuting attorneys? Would that bring it into parity, or would there be more defense attorneys at that point than prosecuting attorneys? Do you know?
That is a great question. I actually don't know the number of prosecutors. I can look into it. I know we definitely want spending parity with the prosecution office, but I know that sometimes in terms of how many attorneys you actually need, it could be very different because just the activities are very different. But I'm definitely happy to look into it. I would guess I should pull it up. Based on what I've looked at with the RAND, it would probably mean that there were more defenders. We have other standards we're working on that are in the middle of the RAND standards and the 1973 that we think are more realistic. And just guessing, I would bet that's closer to parity. But if you have numbers anywhere of prosecutors and know where I could get those, I would love to go down that rabbit hole, absolutely.
Let me see what I can find out too, and I'll see if I can share anything with you.
All right, awesome, thank you. Rich Morrow.
Yeah, no, so Mike, in partial answer to your question, the matrix and the determination for calculating those two is very different. I mean, having worked on a number of these and looked at a number of different studies nationally and then looking at our local stuff, just the way that they're calculated, the way that workloads are calculated between prosecutors and defense lawyers are very different. There are very different duties that each of the parties have. There are very different ways that they calculate the way that lawyers look at things. In Salt Lake County, at least some of the prosecutors try to equate the two, but the two are very different from one another in terms of what, because the operative term here is calculating workload. And so the workload calculations and the responsibilities that go into determining a workload between what a defender does and what a prosecutor does is very different. And ultimately, I would suggest that prosecutors can take on a higher caseload for a couple of reasons. Number one, the cases usually come to them and they're pretty well prepared and they're pretty well put together. And there's not a whole lot of additional work that they have to do. That's not the same with defense lawyers who get a case, who have to evaluate, develop client relationships and client control, look at the case, conduct independent investigations, and do a number of other things that oftentimes prosecutors don't have to do simply because the case usually comes to them in pretty good shape from the beginning. So a comparison between those two is not always the most accurate indicator of what the various workloads between those two parties looks like.
Great point, Rich. Thanks for bringing that up. So with that in mind, we did meet with with the different systems. We conducted these collaborative interviews. We shared with them the data that we had and what we had recommended as to where they needed additional help, additional funding, and they submitted the applications. For the most part this year, the applications that were submitted by and large followed the recommendations that we made through these meetings. So I think that those meetings were very productive, very helpful. We let them know, what we expected, what we thought was reasonable. And so the amount of requests that we received, you can see, is just over $7 million worth of requests. What we have budgeted for grants this year is 6.3. So we do have some cuts we need to make from the applications that came in. So that's that number there in red. And what we'll do from here is present to you a few avenues, two avenues really, that we think make the most sense to get to that number. Here's a breakdown of the requests that came in. And if you recall, late last year and earlier this year, we had a couple of meetings talking about how we want to prioritize the requests that come in. And we modified our tier system that we used last year. So this reviews that. Tier 1, that's for renewals. Those are funding decisions that we've made in the past. Tier 2 would be an increase in managing defenders, new managing defenders, or requests that increase managing defender capacity. Tier 3 would be other increases for systems that have demonstrated a high operational capacity, meaning basically that their managing defenders were doing a good job of managing the funds that they had already received. And we felt that based on the system needs evaluation, that they would have the capacity to handle more funding, which means more employees, more people to supervise. And then tier 4 would be the lowest priority. Those would be requests that did not fall into that category. There's also another line there that we're calling unrestored cuts. That's for $64,852. So I want to explain that a little bit more. If we could cut to the next slide.
Before you do that, Matt,
Sure.
on that slide, tell me the one where it says tier 3/4. How is that different from tier 4?
Sure. And what that reflects is, and we had touched on this a bit back in the fall or at the end of the year when we were talking about the tiers. What falls into tier 3 versus tier 4 is going to depend on where we draw the line as to what systems have demonstrated that capacity. So depending on I believe Leslie will be able to show this in a bit. There's a whole range of scores based on the system needs evaluation that we did of how a system is complying with the standards, the core principles, especially as it relates to the managing defender and their capacity, their operational capacity. So while we have labeled close to 1.5 million as tier 3, there is some discussion depending on where we draw that line, where those would be considered tier 3 or tier 4 requests. So that's why there's a little bit of ambiguity there, because that's something that we'll need to discuss here in a little bit. So good question. Thank you for asking that.
Yeah, thank you for reviewing that.
So with the unrestored funding, let's go back to the pandemic that we're still in. But if you recall, when the pandemic first hit, we were forced to make some cuts. We had to cut funding that had already been approved for the various systems. And then later on in the year, some of that funding was restored. We were able to restore up to 94% of what had been previously rewarded. And then later on in the funding cycle, during the non-lapsing funding process, some of those systems made requests that resulted in them being funded up to 100% of where they were before those initial pandemic cuts were made. Now, that was something that was, from what I understand, was not necessarily something that had been suggested or recommended on the part of staff. It was just the case that some of the systems made that request, and those were ultimately those were approved by the commission. Now, in going through the funding process and the grant process this year, it became clear that there were probably about 8 systems that never made those requests during that time of non-lapsing funding. And so they are operating under what they would be had they made that request during the non-lapsing funding round to come back up to where they were before those pandemic cuts. And so those requests come to approximately $65,000. Greg, can you show that table there?
Yeah, hang on just 1 second.
So here we have laid out what those cuts amounted to. And you can see that for the most part, they are relatively small cuts that were made to attorney contracts. So anywhere from $1,000 to $5,000 per contract that were cut during the pandemic that weren't restored, that were restored in other systems. So it's our first recommendation with the grant funding is that in the spirit of fairness and equity, that these amounts that were cut from those contracts and these systems here be restored, just to get everybody back on the same playing field as they were before the pandemic cuts occurred. If anybody has any questions about those, please feel free. Rich, I see your hand up.
Would you like a motion, Matt?
Shortly, yes. I just want to take some comments first.
Sure.
Before we do that.
Hey, Matt, the question that I have is, what the pandemic has sort of taught us is sort of the opposite impact that we thought, and that is costs and expenses, particularly for personnel, have gone up substantially. And I'm wondering if under Tier 1, in those circumstances where there have been requests for an increased salary, because to be honest, we've increased the starting salary of workers in our office simply because we've had to. Are we contemplating that in any of the asks that have been made, in addition to looking at restoring the previously unrestored cuts? Are we looking at any increases that may be necessary as part of the Tier 1 request? Because that would obviously not only it would increase the base request under each one of the Tier 1 categories, and I'm wondering if you've thought about that.
And that is, and we'll see when we go through the system by system slides here in a little bit, that there were some systems that requested additional pay increases. That is when we were talking about the tiers back at the end of the year, that is something that came up, whether we wanted to consider that as part of the tier priority. The consensus at that time was not to do that, not to include those in the tiers. That would be like a Tier 4 request, an increase in compensation. Part of the reason for that is there's so much so much variety across the state as far as compensation goes from contract to contract, that it's going to take a lot of work and time and effort to come up with a consistent strategy and process, just so that everybody's feels good about those funding requests and funding awards. And I think that the timing of having Lisa with the Center for Court Innovation become available is really helpful, because that's definitely one of the things that are top of staff list as far as like we figuring out how to not only address the workload situation, but also the compensation piece, because as we all know, there is a really hard time finding people to do the work in general, but then also finding people who being able to compensate people in order to do the work that is so often challenging. Any other questions about the unrestored cut proposal?
The only question I have, and I want to make sure that I understand what you're saying, is what you're trying to do is you're trying to remedy a cut that occurred because of COVID, right?
That's right.
Bring it up so that they are on the same basis as some of the others.
Right. There was some inconsistency as to how those
Okay.
were restored, and so we're trying to remedy that.
That's what I understood you to say, so, okay.
And are not these therefore mostly tier 1 requests in their initial form?
Yes, that's a good way of looking at it, Commissioner Corporal, and that's why we're addressing this kind of separately and initially before we get into the other tiers. We thought this was important enough that we wanted to address it first. All right, it doesn't look like there's any other comments. I think we would need to have a motion and a vote on this first piece.
I'll move that we restore them.
I second it, and the amount is 64,800 plus, correct?
That's right.
Okay, wonderful. So a motion, who made the motion?
I did, Michael.
Michael, and then a second by Sam. Okay, any further discussion on this? All right, let's take a vote. All who are in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay, is there any voting commissioner who is opposed? Okay, we are unanimous again. Thank you for
So
that.
I'm going to have to abstain from the vote because it involves Salt Lake Legal Defender Association.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thanks, Rich.
I was just wondering that too. Does that include UJDA stuff? I should have looked closer. Sorry.
Craig, can you go back to that slide?
Oh, I'm good. I'm good. I vote yes.
Yeah, it looks like Rich is the only one that would have to do that.
And if he abstains, do we still have the quorum that we need to pass it?
Do we lose a quorum when somebody abstains? I don't know the rules on this stuff.
See, that is an excellent question, Michael, that I think Pam can answer that because she's been most recently looking at that issue with the Sentencing Commission. And I can't remember what we decided.
Oh, yeah, that's a tricky one.
Well, we do have 12 commissioners here present, and I believe, please, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we need more than half the full commission in order to have a quorum. Is that right? Which would be 8.
Yeah, then
Okay.
you got plenty.
Okay, we are good. Very good. Thank you for clarifying that. So we're still over and above. All right, great. Keep going. Thank you.
All right, so I mentioned earlier that we have 2 ways that we think we can get to the target amount of the funding that's been requested. The first option's laid out here. As I mentioned earlier, we had talked about establishing a cutoff for tier 3. That would be having a cutoff for what systems have demonstrated a higher degree of organizational capacity. So if we were to fund tier 1 fully, tier 2 fully, and tier 3 fully, that would fund those requests, and we would still have $140,000 and 500 left to allocate. And so we could go down ways to do that. One of the issues, though, that we came to when we were thinking about this is that a lot of while the requests that came in by and large did follow the recommendations that we had come up with when we were talking about the system needs evaluations and the caseload surveys and how many attorneys were needed. There was some deviation from that. And so, for example, some requests that came in were requesting more attorneys, for example, than what we had recommended to them. So with that, if we could go to option number 2. This is, as you can see, that's our staff favorite. What this option does is it closely aligns with what the recommendations were through those system needs evaluations, and it falls more in line with what we think that is needed for those different systems. And we feel that this is a fairer way to do it than the just funding everything that was coming in from tier 3 requests. And so the reason for that is that if we were to go with simply funding the tier 3 requests, there would be some of the smaller counties who might have a more acute need that were left out because they do have maybe a newer managing defender who didn't have quite that organizational capacity, but the need on the ground was really there and really acute. And so this is what we would recommend at the end, once we've presented the actual applications that come in that the commission approve. So this is just a kind of a roadmap. We wanted to highlight this before we went through the applications and addressed the requests that came in. And before we do that, though, I do want to thank everybody for filling out those survey questions, for looking over the applications beforehand, and for making those comments. It really helped us to understand what some concerns were. And I think just there were some common questions that came up about that were more philosophical in nature. You know, how much should we be sharing the burden between a particular county? You know, should it be 50-50? What should the split be? Again, with some of the compensation concerns that Commissioner Morrow brought up, these were some of the comments that we were receiving. And so again, going back to the strategic planning, we're really excited to have those broader, bigger discussions in the context of strategic planning. And we hope that we can come to some good, consistent guidance through that process. So with that, I'm going to pitch it back to Greg, and we're going to go through each of the system applications, and we're happy to address any questions that you have as we go through those.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And I also would like to say thank you, commissioners, for taking the time to read through these applications. And we've tried to incorporate answers to individual questions in this presentation. But as I go through these, if there's any other questions that you have or comments that you want to make, Please feel free to interrupt, or I will pause at the end of each slide. Just as a warning, there's 10 of these slides, so bear with me. I'll try to be expedient. Just the layout here of these slides before I jump into them is color coded by tier. So you can see the pink color here is the pilot program. We've already said that we will kind of set that aside and address that in a future meeting. So I won't mention those further. Blue is tier 1, green is tier 2, and then yellow is tier 3 or 4. The unrestored cuts will also be on here. Since we've already addressed those, I won't go into those further as well. And then one last thing to mention, just on the right side, there's an indicator for each line item, each grant request, showing whether or not that was an item that was suggested by IDC staff at the collaborative meeting for each system. So this first slide incorporates the regional project that we have with iron, beaver, and cane. So just a quick note on this application. They chose to provide separate applications, even though this is a regional project. That didn't give you all of the context sometimes when we're individually reading these. So I wanted to mention that. But this is a regional project that is currently operating that way. So they have requested renewal of their existing grant items. And then they have an administrative assistant that's currently funded in iron that supports the managing defender position. They've included a new request to provide expanded funding for that position to provide support to the contract attorneys in Beaver and Kane counties. So that is something that was not recommended in their collaborative meeting and would fall into a tier 3 or 4, depending on the management capacity threshold that's set by the commission. One other new request on this one is for an additional district court contract in Iron County. That is something that was recommended based on the system needs evaluation and caseload surveys. Any questions or comments on that system? Great. So moving on, the next application.
Oh, sorry, Greg, it's
Yes.
Doreen.
Sure.
Because sorry, I'm not catching my video back on, but because they did it, they all did separate applications, and because it wasn't discussed about the administrative assistant shared with our staff in advance. Just, do we know more about that, or do you want to bring that up later? I'm just curious about that. Is Iron, or is the other county in favor of that? Is Iron in favor of that? I don't know. Have you learned any more since that time? Just curious.
So although the applications were separate, they were all written by the managing defender.
Oh, okay.
So I believe that they would support that request. And we have just looked at it in terms of adding that additional funding. You'll see that there's some other systems that have asked for admin support for contract attorneys that are not in a management position. And so we've tiered it the same way that we have tiered those other requests.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Good question. Thank you. So the next application.
Hey, Greg, I actually have a
Yes.
question. And
Sure.
this may be more appropriate for really drilling down better at the strategic planning meeting, but do we have a breakdown in the definition of responsibilities for the managing defender versus the administrative assistant, what those job titles look like, whether we have, and measuring may not be the right word, but whether we're measuring to see whether each one of those people that fit into each of those categories is performing the duties that we're compensating them to do. Is there a way to do that? Because I just think we're going to begin seeing more and more, and I think it's probably wholly appropriate, administrative assistants And what are they doing, and what's the market for that, and how are we compensating it? And is there a way for us to really properly evaluate that, if you will?
Yeah, that's a good question, Matt. Do you want to handle that one, or?
Sure, I'd love to. And Rich, of course, as always, you're spot on on that kind of question. That is something that we as staff has recognized, that there is some, there needs to be more consistency across these systems as far as what the expectations are, what the compensation is for both managing defenders and administrative assistants. One of the real benefits that we've gained in hiring Jenny on board is that she worked as an admin assistant to the Uinta County system for many years, and so she knows that inside and out, that job description. And so she and Leslie have been having regular roundtables with admins throughout the states to help train them on data collection, defender data, and the like. And so that's been really beneficial. But yes, that's something that we have our eye on. As you know, we have started the managing defender roundtables as well. And we are going to be incorporating in the grant contracts some actual expectations for those managing defenders as part of the grant award, making it clear what we're expecting from them, and we'll be able to put that in the contract and be able to follow up with that as well.
No, thank you, Matt.
As far as the compensation goes, though, that is something that we're going to need to work on with strategic planning coming up.
Okay, cool. Any other questions before I move on? There. So the next application is Box Elder County. Their request included renewals as well as unrestored cuts. And I will only mention on this, they applied for the social worker pilot program, and the tier 4 request here is $1,000 for equipment for that social worker. So that request is tied to the social worker request. On cash, they applied for renewals as well. And then they applied for 2 items that were not recommended at the collaborative meeting, which is a full-time investigator position and a support staff for contracted defenders. And then they also applied for 1 item that was recommended by the IDC staff, which is a serious felony contract conflict attorney. And then also they had 1 item that was an unrestored cut. Any questions or discussion on those 2?
Greg, it's Rich again. Hey, what's that support staff? What is that? The support staff for contracted defenders, what is that?
So that would be similar to an administrative assistant or paralegal.
That would be different though than the role that the other admin staff that we would have, or it would be the same? I mean, some of those folks, I guess it was to my earlier question, some of those folks are actually like filing pleadings and doing things like that on behalf of attorneys. And some of them are creating files and defender data and then dispersing cases and then gathering data. Is that the same role, or is that a different role? Do you know?
I can't remember offhand if they went into more detail in their narrative, but we consider it to fall into the same funding category. And so at a tier level, it would be considered the same.
One last question. Are you prioritizing those differently? And the reason I ask that is, I mean, if you look at someplace like Washington County, they have, I wouldn't say a lot of detail, but they have some detail in theirs about what they envision the administrative assistant to do. And I'm wondering if we as a commission are we prioritizing the file creation, data collection over the kind of more traditional support staff services role of kind of entering appearances of counsel, calendaring on behalf of lawyers, uploading discovery and those sorts of things?
So far in the tier structure that is established, the admin support that we have placed in a higher tier level has to show a direct connection to improving the management structure. So that would include, like, if they're creating that capacity to have the data entry and things like that, or the grant, helping the managing defender with the grant functions, that would tie them into that tier 2 capacity level.
Just a question, does this include, I noticed, I think it's in Uinta or maybe Box Elder, there was the suggestion of hiring somebody to basically do input for defender data for people who didn't, for lawyers who didn't want to do it themselves. Is this within the scope of that sort of activity?
Yeah, I think what you're referencing in the Uinta application is for their existing admin assistant to start doing some data entry for their conflict providers, which is something that we think is a good idea. That's a position that's already funded as a county employee on that one. So that's definitely something that can be a part of those roles.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And Greg, if I can just jump in for a second, in response to Rich's question too, as we'll see as we get down to the Washington County request, that admin request where it is more focused towards data reporting and the like, that does fall under a tier 2 request rather than the lower priority 3 or 4 for the one requested here in cash.
And this is Lorene. Mary, did you have a question too? I think I see your hand up.
Oh, yes, I was just going to point out that in the Iron County material as well, it talks about having an assistant available to attend court hearings by WebEx, and how convenient that is to have somebody logging all the data as it's happening, that's much more efficient and actually captures the data, which rings true to me. So.
Thank you.
Okay, so the next application is Carbon County. So they are requesting renewal as well as a tier 2 district court contract that would specifically reduce the managing defender's caseload. This particular managing defender does have a high caseload, and that is something that was recommended by IDC staff. And then they also have an unrestored FY21 cut. Davis County is requesting renewal, and also 2 items that were recommended at the collaborative meeting: a complex case specialty contract and a social worker contract focused on adult criminal. They've also requested a tier 4 item that is just a compensation increase for the currently funded additional defender contract. Okay, hearing no questions on those.
It looks like Rich has a question.
Yeah, sorry, I have another question. Hey,
Oh, sure.
I do have a question about sort of the complex case. There's a number of those this year. Mm-hmm. What's our criteria for hiring those folks, for salary considerations for those folks, and what are the standards that we're applying, and how do we anticipate those caseloads will be allocated between the folks that we hire under that rubric?
So Matt, I can take a stab at this one, and then you can bail me out if I do miserably. But with the complex case contracts, we do have a couple of those currently funded with Weber County, and those have a grant condition set on them we will reimburse up to $125 per hour. So that is something we could continue that grant condition into this particular contract if it's funded. Washington County also has a similar request. However, they're asking for flat fee contracts on theirs, I believe.
Do we know what the expectation will be for the number of cases that we give people? Are they going to be segregated from the rest of the folks that are accepting appointments? Do we know? I mean, I like the idea. I'm just kind of wondering how we're going to oversee and manage this idea that we're going to have really two tiers. A general group of lawyers that will do district court work, and then a specialty group of lawyers that will do this other special work. And are they the same lawyers, and are they given a lower caseload? Do we know how that works?
I can speak to that if you want, Greg. So there's two facets to this. So one, in Weaver, they are two completely different attorneys. There are attorneys that have different caseloads for their specialty contracts, and then I think only one of them even has another contract with the county. And a lot of this gets into the work Jenny has been leading and I've been helping with on those case weighting sheets. And so the case weighting lets managing defenders very quickly see what type of cases are being appointed and hopefully reassign them if it doesn't fit an attorney's skill set or that an attorney is overweighted. And so in this case, if you had these specialty attorneys and an attorney who is, let's say, straight out of law school, got appointed to a murder case, the managing defender would quickly be able to reassign that to someone on this specialty case contract. That makes sense.
So is it a separate, so like for Weber, for example, I think they have 12 lawyers. Is it a separate team of lawyers? Is that what's anticipated? Like it's a whole separate group?
Yeah, so in Weaver, they have two specifically named attorneys. So it's Martin Gravis, I think, and Grant Morrison are their two specialty court attorneys. They only do these cases and they bill specifically, like Greg said, $125 an hour for these specific cases.
Yeah, but Martin has a contract up there too.
Right, which is a separate contract. So.
Oh, I see. Okay. So when you're talking about these particular lawyers, this is separate and apart from any of the contractual obligations or caseloads that these people have. They're going to be identified separately, and they're going to be working separately under a separate kind of contract for the work that they're doing on these cases.
Right, and it's something we want to see more in rural areas too, because one thing we found doing this case weighting is complex sex cases and homicides just completely disrupt the case weighting system. If you only have 3 attorneys, you just cannot possibly balance cases that take that long. And so even in Washington, which is still large, it's a similar issue where if those cases are just so many more hours that having a separate flow for how they're handled seems to make a lot of sense.
No, I agree. And my one last question, and that is, how are we managing their caseloads to ensure that they do have the time to devote? Because you're right, Leslie. These are really difficult cases both to wait and to work on, and so it's a good point.
So let me just add, Rich, too. I think you're hitting right on a few of the points we've talked about too, and things we have to define as we go forward. We're recommending this funding with some recognition that the system's still being designed, right? But we've seen places around the state where this is absolutely needed, in part because of the rotating assignment of cases between judges and attorneys assigned to courtrooms. So some of these things will be really helpful, although we've got to figure out over time as a full commission how we set parameters and expectations, right? So I think that question is really crucial. But that's why we're making a recommendation this year.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for bringing those all up. Very good questions and discussion.
Okay, so the next 2 slides address the regionalization project in Juab, Millard, Sanpete, and Nephi. The system needs evaluation on this regional system showed that they were meeting their baseline in most cases. So with Juab, Millard, and Nephi, there were no new funding items recommended, and they followed those directions, or that guidance, I should say, and requested only renewal. Sanpete requested renewal and then also an additional part-time juvenile delinquency contract that was recommended based upon the system needs evaluation. So pretty basic there. On the next application is Price City. They're requesting renewal of their conflict counsel contract. They have also requested that the IDC consider covering the cost of increased contracts due to attorney turnover. And those two increases have been set at tier 4. Salt Lake County has requested renewal of its existing grant funded items. It has requested a full-time investigator contract with UJDA that was recommended at the collaborative meeting, and it's a tier 3 or 4 item. They also have requested us to fund compensation increases for the 5 attorneys that are currently funded on the grant. Of that, part of that increase is an unrestored cut. So we've made that separation there. Any questions or comments on those?
Salt Lake County was way over the top. I reviewed that one.
What did you say, Sam?
I said that Salt Lake County's requests were way over the top. I reviewed that one, but I'm glad that Rich doesn't vote on it.
Sam, when you're in trouble, Sam, we'll have to it'll be a question about whether or not we can represent you.
I know exactly what's gonna happen. You're
Well,
gonna deny representation.
Can I just ask a
A
question?
person of color, no less.
Can I just ask a question? I mean, and I think maybe this is what Rich was getting at before, but I think what I'm starting to panic when I see this stuff is how out of whack the counties are in pay structure. And that we're basically pitting counties against each other, because if you look at the counties outside of Salt Lake County, all these people in rural areas are going to be making more than the people in Rich's office with higher caseloads. And same thing like with my office, and same thing with the request for social workers. The request for the amount of salaries for social workers is way out of whack with what coming out of schools are, and no clarification as to CSWs versus LCSWs. And what's going to end up happening is all of the people that are going to go to these rural areas for more money are going to be trained by Rich and I. So I'm all about spreading the wealth, and I understand Sam's point that maybe Salt Lake County's asking for a lot here, but I think we also, I mean, there is just like absolutely no rhyme or reason to the salary structures in these requests.
So Pam, so by way of explanation, as you know, I mean, we spent the last couple of years in Salt Lake County really doing a lot of market analysis. And
That's
part
my
of that
point.
market
We
analysis,
had to justify it based on market comparisons.
right? And look, I'm not sure we're ready to do that yet as an IDC, because it's a long, torturous process of looking at lots of numbers and doing lots of comparisons and sitting down with HR people. But it's also based on the cost of living. And so, I mean, our compensation increases in Salt Lake County have been necessary, and to the credit of our county funding partners, they've actually funded those simply because they know they've had to, because of the cost of living. I mean, I can't speak to what happens outside of here, but the data that we have, and I can include Pam in this, is really based on a lot of market information that we've provided to our funding partners in Salt Lake County. And I just think that's probably something we need to think about more holistically as we think about a statewide system and we do our planning moving forward.
Yeah, and there are differences in cost of living around the state, right? That is part of it. We have also in Davis County, just across the board, for our employees, had to do some serious market analysis, and we like that's not a one-time thing. We keep having to do it, right? So it is a very big deal.
Gareth, this is Tom. Can I make a comment?
Yeah, please, Tom, go.
I completely understand and appreciate what Pam's saying and others, and I understand the kind of the frustration, and certainly law enforcement world knows that really, really well, because there are a lot of shared group activity things that, you know, where this could be a similar type comparison, and then there's the individual. That's going to be very difficult, if almost impossible, to try to manage on a state level, which to me is why it's so important that these agencies, organizations have skin in the game. It'd be one thing if IDC was paying everything, and then we had these disparate salaries and costs. But at least if they're paying a portion or a share that we feel is fair, then the rest of it is that market competition that's just not going to ever be easy to fix and resolve, but is probably the best we can do, at least in my opinion.
So I just had a question. I thought that Pam was suggesting that the rural salaries proposed are above the urban ones. Is that right, Pam? Is that what you're saying for these social work jobs and all?
Well, I just think some of them, not all of them, but I think if you look at some of them, they're like the salaries in certain areas are significantly higher. And I'm trying to not pick on anything in particular, because listen, I am not opposed to people getting paid more money or anything like that. Like, I'm all about an understanding that the market is going crazy right now, and all of us in all counties and all professions are having a hard time maintaining folks and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, some of the requests for salaries in some of the areas, when I'm looking at them in comparison, and Rich is right, like Salt Lake County, we did one and we had to look at market comparisons, and our market comparison at UJDA wasn't as high tech as Rich's, but we did do one, and Salt Lake County did really great stuff for our office. I think like us, for everyone, we're still behind the market. And that's kind of an issue across the board, like I said. But yeah, when you start to look at stuff, we're not really, when we're evaluating the requests, I don't know how much we're evaluating the monetary request based on like a market structure at all, if that makes sense.
Well, I can say for our part, we are eager to have this broader conversation, right? I mean, that's something that we recognize, and part of the history too is that when IDC was getting off the ground and we had this funding and we had to try and demonstrate that there was a need for this funding, and there weren't a lot of requests coming in, you know, not a lot of counties were on board. And so I think that there was, as you can see with some of these renewals, where there is some discrepancy from year to year as these grants were made. And so we are interested and anxious in revisiting some of those and trying to bring some more consistency across the state with some of these grants. And that's something that is going, as Rich and you both know, is going to take some time and some study and some work to do that. You know, and there's so many different factors that go into that as well, as far as the rural versus urban versus, you know, public defender office versus contractors who, you know, aren't getting benefits included with their salaries, or have to pay for overhead and pay for their own admin assistant out of pocket, pay for their Westlaw, et cetera, et cetera. So those are all things that we'll need to take into account when we have that conversation.
So you're thinking in the long run, we might be establishing something like market analyses of individual counties or areas?
I don't know if we'll be able to get, you know, very hyper localized with that, but what I would like to see is at least some consistency amongst the contract amounts that we're awarding throughout the state. I think that's important to try and get a handle on.
Thank you.
Michael, I think the best you're probably going to do is establishing some ranges. And that's I don't want to say it's relatively easy, but it's better because if you have a job description and you know what that looks like, there's enough data out there to be able to establish a range. Like I think there's one social worker here that requests for $90,000. And if that includes benefits, that's probably okay. If it doesn't include benefits and their benefits are being paid by the county, that would be an experienced, a really pretty significantly experienced social worker that you'd want to have, because we're looking at ranges of realistically $55,000 to $70,000 for social workers coming out of social work school, and in some instances that's hard to find too. But so there is a range that you'd want to look at, and the question, and to Pam's point, if there's an offer to pay somebody $90,000 and the county will cover benefits, there's a likelihood that you would see a shift from one of the people that we may pay from one county going to this other county because the IDC is funding that amount. And it's a little bit unclear to me what market analysis was used to determine that range. Is it experience, or is that contemplated somebody right out of social work school? So those are the things I think that are probably fair points for us to discuss.
Yeah, and I suppose we have to, in smaller counties, we might have to wonder about whether these are targeted for particular people rather than qualifications.
I think sometimes just the rural nature that can be just a very limited pool, and trying to get somebody to move there. It'll be good discussions, but I just, my gut tells me, I've watched the league and others try to deal with these pay battle issues. It's very, very difficult and tricky. Maybe a range, maybe it's more about if you're hiring somebody, you must have benefits included, and then this, so that everyone, maybe it's things like that. But I'm very leery of trying to define that too much, because no one else that I'm aware of has been able to do a good job of that.
I appreciated your comment, Tom, about the skin in the game, right? I mean, from the time I was a brand new commissioner learning about this, even to now, there's definitely a balancing act. And the counties are vastly different, and I represent all counties here. A balancing act, I think, for us and the state's funding to expect that all the counties value this work and do all that they can to keep making progress. And there are definitely differences in the budgets and differences in commissioners' understanding of it. I'm talking about county commissioners' understanding of it, right? So anyway, I appreciate the skin in the game, covering the benefits, kind of some of that stuff might be helpful to us in the future.
And it occurs to me that it may be even more difficult in this tight job market for employers to find somebody with a particular skill set willing to locate or probably relocate to a particular rural location than it is to find somebody in the Wasatch Front area. If you're looking for a particular skill set and that person is going to have to not only accept the job, but pack up an entire family and move. If they're going to need a different car or a car in order to do the job, etc., that becomes a more expensive person to court into that position. That strikes me as being a possibility.
All wonderful points. Lisa's definitely gonna have her work cut out for her trying to put this into a plan, but I do appreciate all of the wonderful points and perspectives that we have in this conversation. And again, I'm eager for her to be able to get to work and to help us through this discussion. Any other questions on this particular slide before Greg moves on? Greg, why don't you move to the next one?
Sure. Thanks, Matt. So this is the regional project for Sevier and Wayne. They have requested, in addition to their renewals, unrestored cuts essentially, and there is a small compensation increase that was included, I believe, just an addition error when calculating those unrestored cuts. So mainly just renewals there. Any concern on that one? The next application is Tooele County. They've requested renewals as well as a part-time adult criminal district attorney contract that they have related to a reduction in workload for their managing defender. This item was not recommended by IDC staff at the collaborative meeting, as a similar item was actually funded last year to reduce the workload of that managing defender. So we did not feel it was necessary in this funding cycle. There were two items that we had recommended, however. One is a part-time parental defense attorney contract, and the other is a part-time social worker contract. There was question on that one as to whether that was a pilot program request. The county actually envisions using an adult district court social worker, so that would not be a pilot program position. And then with Uinta County, they've requested renewals and unrestored cuts, as well as the social worker pilot program. Any questions or comments on these two? All right. Utah County.
Hey, Greg, just back on that, the funding for that part-time criminal that we funded last go around and now we're not funding now, is that something that we would typically just do as a one-time funding, and then the expectation is they can pick it up going forward? Or did we look at the workload to see if, you know, it stayed up or dropped down? I guess I can see from their perspective, or they might go, "Yep, we justified it, you funded it, now you're saying no, why?"
Yeah, so to clarify, first of all, this it's not that we stopped funding it, it's that this is a duplicate request. So they already got one, they're asking for a second to do the same thing.
Okay, that answers it. Thank you, Leslie.
Good question. All right, so then next application is Utah County. Utah County on the system needs evaluation did not show any improvements that were necessary so they were meeting the minimum standards that we're hoping to achieve across the state. They did include some requests. The first one is a change in an existing grant funded position, which would make it from a child welfare part-time position into a 60% delinquency, juvenile delinquency contract. So it would be an increase in the workload or the capacity of that contract with an associated dollar amount. So we have that as a tier 3 or 4 request, whereas the other two requests were compensation increases related to their conflict provider contracts. So those fall under tier 4. And Washington County, they've requested renewal, as well as a grant-focused administrative assistant position that would work with their managing defender to improve their grant performance, as well as using their usage on case management software. And then there's also a capacity increase that they're requesting for their managing defender contract, which would essentially fund additional time for that managing defender to spend on doing management duties. They also requested 2 complex case specialty contracts. Those were tier 3 or 4 items that were suggested in the collaborative meeting.
Greg, with all of the complex specialty contract requests, is the money budgeted? And then if they don't use it all, what happens with any surplus? Are they always billed at $125 an hour?
That's a good question. So on this particular request, you can see that the dollar amount is the same as their other district court contract. They're actually requesting flat fee attorneys here. So they would work a consistent caseload and get paid on a flat fee basis. With the Weber County hourly type structure, anything that's not used on our grants comes back to the IDC. We have non-lapsing authority, and that's the funding that we are going to be using for things like our defense resource funding, funding for rural mileage, and other projects that we would have come up.
You know, Rich brought this up before, but are we going to have some sort of a definition or criteria for what's considered a complex specialty case? Is it murder and first-degree sex offenses? What is it?
They've outlined in each of the proposals, they've outlined what caseload those contractors would work. So we would hold them to what they've outlined in their applications. If we want to work in additional grant conditions, that's something that we could, the commission could make a motion on, or we could look into it in strategic planning and try to find a plan for.
For the case weighting, the way that Jenny set up the case weighting sheet, if we want to set it at just that homicides or complex sex cases, Jenny and I actually went through the entirety of the statutes in the state and put everything in a category. And so there is the possibility to do it that way too, to say if it's any of these statutes, it's in that category. If it's not, it's out of there. So we've got multiple ways that we could set this up.
I don't know if it's necessary, but I just want to be sure that the county isn't asking for extra money, just another way to get another attorney when they're just asking for another attorney, whether it's really a complex case or not. But I guess the staff with both Washington County and Davis County is recommending that we approve that. Is that correct?
That's right, Commissioner Bugman. And part of this was something that surfaced in the collaborative meetings that we did with Washington County in particular, where the managing defender there talked about how because of some contract changes, people moving in and out, he had to award the contracts to a couple of brand new attorneys right out of law school and never tried a case. And then he was struggling with what to do with these serious cases, and he needed people to take them, but didn't feel, rightly so, didn't feel good about giving them to a brand new attorney. And so this is something that evolved out of that conversation. And so that's why it does have that yes on the suggested in the collaborative meeting.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Matt, did they give you any indication about who they were contemplating hiring for these? And the reason I ask that is, 64,356 for an annual salaries for a lawyer is not that high. And number one, who's he contemplating hiring? And number two, kind of Leslie and Wally's point, what's that caseload going to look like? It says, because I reviewed this and I reviewed the Washington County application, and it says special victim crimes, specifically homicide and serious sex cases. Is he contemplating sort of just taking these two lawyers and carving out those cases? And if so, how many cases is he carving out to give these folks for that amount of money? Do we know?
Well, Leslie's looking at that. I do want to point out that, you know, contracts do not necessarily equate to a full-time defender or a full-time employee. So that's something to try to bear in mind as we look at these contracts. But Leslie, do you have any more information on that?
Sorry, it's opening. I've got an analysis on how many of these higher level cases are in each county. So I can tell you as soon as it decides to open, how many are. But as Matt said, and we'll get into this in the compensation, outside of Salt Lake County and Utah County, it is incredibly hard to tell whether these contracts are full-time or part-time. And so I would definitely say from this compensation structure that $64,000 is not expected to be a full-time annual salary. It's expected to be a part of their work. So in Washington County, if we're going with just non-capital murder and minimum mandatory, they have last year, I think this was, they had 3 homicides and 38 minimum mandatory statutes. And the way we've weighted this, which I know Commissioner Mara, you've seen, it would be about 15 cases for a full-time attorney to handle these a year. So under our recommendations, really, it could be closer to 3.5 attorneys handling this caseload, but that's not with the NAC standards. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Do you think that 2 lawyers at 64.3 could handle those 41 cases?
Depending on what math you use, it would be somewhere around 6,000 attorney hours, which, you know, a lot of our work in the state right now is getting people to build up the time that they spend on cases, just because they haven't been able to spend time on cases because they're overloaded. So this, I think, would just be a start to getting these handled correctly. So I would not say that this is an over ask, if that's what you're asking.
No. I'm just wondering if it's going to be fair to. No, I don't think it is an over ask. I'm just wondering if it's going to be fair to the lawyers to expect them to take on, 2021 serious sex cases. And I'm looking at Wally because he knows what a caseload like that. He probably doesn't have a caseload like that, but he knows what those caseloads look like. And that's just a lot of cases to put on somebody of that type of case per year. And I'm just wondering, is that even sufficient, or are they divided differently between the other lawyers on the team?
I think this would result in still many of the cases going to the other contract attorneys, and this would just get some of them off their plate.
I have the same concerns as Rich just expressed, and I would also point out that in King County or Wayne County or Piute County, one bad weekend can tip all of this completely out of kilter.
Yeah, I analyze these numbers all the time and definitely agree with you. And so it's one thing that I'm interested in. I'm speaking out of turn a little bit here, but creating these types of complex case panels for rural counties, I think could be a really interesting future IDC project. Because like you said, Commissioner Corbett, we've seen that. We know what it was like in Duchesne on the cases you were on, and similar places where I think Jenny put it that if you assign one homicide to somebody, to balance it out, you'd have to assign the next 60 or 100 misdemeanors to the other attorney, which is just not doable.
So Leslie, if I hear you correctly, this is really a starting point for us to kind of continue that conversation as we move forward.
Absolutely.
And if it is a starting point, the only point that I want to make is the following. We are not leaving it up to the individual counties to define what the complex case is. That should come as a directive from the commission, because that way it'll be even across the state. So that you're not looking at a complex case in Washington County differently than you are, say, in Piute County or whatever. If it's defined the same from the commission, then everyone labors under the same directive.
Leslie, you just mentioned that, you know, the data that you looked at non-capital murder cases or non-capital homicide cases and sex-related offenses that involve minimum mandatories. Is that right? I mean, I think that is a pretty good place to start, Commissioner Alba. I think it would be, might be worth voting on that during the course of this meeting.
I agree, because as I understood it, you know, some of the definitions for complex cases, we were relying on what the different counties were telling us.
Mm-hmm.
It ought to be uniform throughout the state.
And then that is something, sorry, that is something that we can write into our award contract as well. I mean, that's definitely something that is not a heavy lift for us to do.
Yep. Okay.
And I guess I'd add to that, if we don't need a motion on that, but if that's the direction the commission would like to go, I think that helps us to know we'll impose that expectation.
I'm not sure how our designation of how we define a complex case solves the problem that Rich talked about. And that is giving appropriate compensation to the lawyers that take on the responsibility to take on these tough cases. I mean, it doesn't quite answer that question.
Nobody gives uniformity to what's being considered.
Well, I agree. I want the uniformity. I agree with Mr. Alba.
And it may be in the future, you know, as we set things up going forward, that there's a pool of money that's not allocated that is I hate the word slush fund, but it allows for money to be shifted to those counties that are experiencing an unusual. I think that's going to be a factor that would be a wise way of doing this if we can get there.
Tom, I say this to my clients all the time. I don't ever want to hear you say slush fund again. That's not the way we're going to articulate it.
I agree. But you understand the thought, the principle.
You know, with just a separate thing, I completely agree with what's being said, but the question of appeal on these cases as well for, I mean, 3rd to 6th class counties, you know, we've got handled, but particularly the 2nd class counties outside of, you know, Utah County, it's an interesting, you know, question as far as, you know, cost and budget and expertise, even just like appellate expertise. So that's something else I think we need to keep in mind as we have that larger discussion.
Any other questions or comments on the Washington County application?
Yeah, Matt, I was a little bit confused because I didn't understand the narrative in the Washington County. So is the managing defender not going to have a caseload now? Is that what the purpose was between hiring some additional staff, including the admin, these complex specialty attorneys, and then increasing the funding for the managing defender? Was that intended to take the managing defender off of a caseload completely? I was a little bit unclear about that.
Yeah, Greg, can you speak to that?
Yeah, so to my understanding of what was happening is that the managing defender contract included a full caseload, but that was being delegated to another attorney. So the managing defender had a small amount of money, approximately $24,000, that was then funding the management duties. And so what's happening in this proposal is that contract is going to actually be separated out with the caseload. That attorney that was essentially subbing it would be the named contractor. And then the managing defender would then focus solely on management still, but at a higher number of hours, essentially.
What, so how much would we be paying the managing defender? Would it be the 26 plus the 23?
Yeah, so 50,000 would be
Okay.
the new created managing defender contract. So his caseload actually from the current grant year to next would still, he essentially does not carry a public defender caseload for Washington County.
And what are the expectations that we would be having, since that role is now actually a new role in Washington County? What are our expectations of what we see the manager defender doing there?
So that again falls back to the previous conversation about managing defender duties. We do have the managing defender duties that were published, I believe, in April of last year to our website. And the managing defenders have signed a statement saying that they will work toward completing those duties with the IDC. But it's definitely something that we could improve upon and create more structure to hopefully in strategic planning.
And Rich, and not only that, we will be writing into the contracts a specific list of expectations. You know, with the 2019, that was kind of a soft rollout with the managing defender duties, but now we're into it far enough that we feel we can start requiring some results and having those expectations more clearly defined and have some accountability there.
Do we need to make a motion on this?
I don't know if we're at a motion yet. I mean, we can circle back to the options after we just have one more application, essentially.
Right.
So the last application is Weber County. So they've requested renewals as well as an additional district contract to reduce managing defender caseload. That was a recommendation in the collaborative meeting. They've also requested a number of tier 3 or 4 requests. You can see one of those was not recommended. It was an additional district court contract beyond what we had recommended. Weber did show one of the greatest needs in the state for additional contracts. So we did recommend the adult court social worker position, 2 additional district court contracts, and 3 additional juvenile delinquency child welfare contracts. So those are the requests for the Weber application. Any discussion on that?
One thing I would like to note for the commission is, in particular with Weber, while they are requesting and we recommended a significant increase in funding on our part, the system spending increase in Weber County has been significant as well. They've upped their support of indigent defense by how much? Do you have that number handy, Greg?
Approximately, I want to say 640,000.
Which I think is probably close to a 20% increase. Is that ballpark?
Yeah, let me switch to this. So system budget 654,000 was the system increase this year. About a 32% increase in their funding. Any additional discussion on Weber? All right, that will conclude the summary of the application, so I'll turn it back over to you, Matt.
Okay, well, going back to the two different proposals that we had suggested for how to fund these requests. Again, we could do where we fund all of the 1 through 3 tier 3 funding. Again, that would, we do have some, this is our less preferred route because that would end up funding positions and requests that were not recommended through our collaborative meetings and system needs evaluations that have been done. There would be a little bit left over after that tier 3 funding that we would need to take a look at and make some decisions on how to allocate that. That would be about $140,000. And then if you could go to the next slide, Greg. The one that we are recommending, though, is that we fund the requests that were made according to the recommendations that we came up with through the system needs evaluation and in the collaborative meetings. However, we would need to make some cuts in this scenario where in order to come on target with a budget, we would only be able to fund the attorney positions that were requested. So in other words, we wouldn't be able to fund the adult court social workers and investigators that were requested, even if we did recommend those. So that would be the decision that we would need to make, is to give priority to those attorney contracts over the support staff, recognizing that with these recommendations and with the system needs evaluations, we're really just trying to get everybody to the bare minimum here, right? And so that would be what we would recommend to the commission as far as the funding goes. I know that we've relayed a lot of information over the past 2 hours. I want to be conscious of the time commitment. We're coming on the 2 hours here. However, I think that if we were comfortable in proceeding with a vote, we would not have to have that second grant application meeting that we have scheduled for the first part in June. I don't mean to do a high pressure sales pitch here on you, but that is something to consider. So I'll leave it up to the commission as to whether you feel comfortable going with the recommendation that we have here, or if you want time to kind of process that and come back on at another time to take that vote.
Hey, Matt, this is Tom. We can have discussion, but I'm going to make a motion that we adopt option 2.
I second it.
A motion by Tom, a second by Sam, and I will take some discussion. Rich, it looks like you have your hand up.
I do. Thank you, Madam Chair. Hey, Matt, do you know if on some of the social worker positions, is there any grant funding out there that we could find to maybe fund those that would be separate and apart from our budget through the state of Utah? I know some social workers have been funded on that, and that may be an avenue that we may want to pursue and try to track down some additional funding for those positions.
That's a good point. I am not aware myself. I don't know if anything's on Greg's radar, but that is certainly something that we can pursue. I mean, you know how much I love social workers, right? I mean, I know how much good work they can do and how helpful they can be. But if the attorneys are so swamped that they are just trying to pound through their cases, then a social worker is not going to be much use.
And I think that is one of the ideas that we could support, Rich, right? Help find people information so they can see if they can move forward locally. I love the idea too, so support it.
We have been encouraging people to go for social workers, and on the grounds that it produces better outcomes and is more efficient.
Mhm.
So I am a little concerned about declining the social workers, but do you think there is money somewhere out there potentially, or this is just a year for more hardcore needs?
It's hard to say.
Yeah.
I think there's another, I think there's another valid argument to postpone this till we do the strategic planning is we're funding everything that we're already committed to supporting. And if, as we go to look to add new things in, I think we need to make that part of that strategic plan and decide how that looks going forward. So I think that's a good argument to not do it now, do the strategic plan, then go that direction. I do like the idea of the social worker. So maybe that helps.
And I would note that we still do have the parental defense program. So there will be some social work help in that arena, and we'll be bringing that to the commission in the coming weeks.
Well, I think Tom's point's a good one if we're going to be doing this planning.
Figure out the priorities.
Yeah.
The only problem with that planning though is it's going to take some time to come up with any kind of answer. And here you have these requests from the different counties. And I think it behooves us to let them know what we think that they may be able to do in order to plan for the rest of the year.
Okay, thank you for all these comments. Any further questions or discussion? Oh, Mary, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I would just concur, we need to tell these people as soon as possible what they have to work with. And I have exactly the same concerns about social workers and I have serious concerns about cutting requests for investigators, because I think there is a significant argument to be made that adequate investigative resources are an absolute hallmark of good defense work, and that without it, you may in fact not be providing constitutionally adequate defense. And on the other hand, if this is the money that we have, and we have to pick something to cut, clearly cutting necessary attorneys first would not be appropriate. So it is with misgivings that I would vote to support the option 2.
And if I could address that, Commissioner Corcoran, and this is something that, you know, now that we're at the end of this conversation, I think we were remiss to not include this in the presentation. We have allocated or reserved some separate funding for defense resources. So when we were, and this was something that we had touched on or talked about back when we were establishing the tiers, that we were going to treat defense resources, the data collection through the Defender data licenses, and rural mileage. We felt that those were so important that we were going to separate those from the grant program. So there still is going to be resources through the IDC for defense resources, which would include the investigators. I think it was different in the investigative request that was made is there was a request for a full-time, basically a staff employee investigator included in that grant request. So although this recommendation would deny that piece, that full-time investigator, if the need is there, that system can come to the IDC for reimbursement for investigative needs. So I hope that helps with your concerns.
Commissioner, Chair, come on, I have to get on this other call. I apologize. I have to leave. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we're probably just about ready to vote. And that was some good clarification, Matt. Thank you for that. All right, so
could I mention one other thing really quickly?
Oh, please go ahead, Greg.
The only funding stream that I can think of aside from ours that I've seen that could be used for social workers and actually has in the past is CCJJ's JAG funding. In the past, I believe Salt Lake County may even currently have a social worker position funded through that. So future funding opportunities might open for that program, but counties would want to apply directly with CCJJ for those funds.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I have heard about that before too. So yeah, brings it to my memory. Okay, well, great comments and questions. And we do have a motion and a second. So I think I'll go ahead and call for a vote and perhaps do a roll call vote for this one. Let's see if I can get everybody's names up. Okay, yeah, I'll go ahead and call out for commissioners' vote on the motion to approve this option 2, which has been presented to us. And again, it's up on the screen, but it's funding items that were recommended in our collaborative meetings based on system needs evaluation and caseload surveys. And then to prioritize the attorneys and the caseloads, which I think we had some really good discussion about, and then funding. Oh, well, the slide is now gone, but.
Sorry, I thought it would be helpful for you to be able to see who is on
Yeah,
the
no,
call, to be
that's
able to do the roll call.
That's great.
We
I
can
think we
put
went
it back
over it
up.
really well. So everyone still remembers the motion, right? It's tier 2 or the option 2. Okay, very good. So let's go ahead. I'm just going to go down here. Okay, go ahead. Let's see. Your vote on the motion. Let's start with Margaret Lindsay. Hopefully you're still there.
I am, and I vote yes.
Oh, very good. Okay, thank you. And then, gosh, this is going really weird on me a little bit. Okay, so Mary Corporon.
I vote yes.
Thank you. Heather Shriver.
Yes.
Thank you. Michael Drexel.
Yes.
Thank you. Wally Bugden.
Yes.
Thank you. Let's see. Rich Morrow.
Yes.
Thank you. Tom Ross. I think you're muted, Tom.
Yes.
Oh, very good. Thank you. Ryan Luce.
Yes.
Okay. Lorraine Kamalu, I vote yes. Is there any commissioner that I missed?
Michael Zimmerman, I vote yes.
Yes, there you go. Thank you, Michael. My list was bouncing around just a little bit. Okay, anyone else that I missed? Okay, I think that's it. And I think we still had a quorum. Katrina, are you the one kind of watching that?
And just one minor thing. I think that Commissioner Morrow would need to abstain from the Salt Lake County vote.
And Weber County vote.
And Weber County, yeah.
Sorry,
Okay.
thank you for that reminder, Matt.
And that's a good point, Matt. I would need to abstain from Utah, San Pete, Millard, Juab, and I suppose Nephi City as well.
Very good. Thank you, Margaret. Okay. Does that capture everything we need, Matt?
It does, and even with the abstentions, we have a sufficient number of commissioners here for a quorum, so I think we are in good shape.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to just go through these last couple things. I don't have additional comments as chair. Is there anyone from the public who is in this meeting who would like to make a comment? Okay, hearing none. So this next meeting that was potentially June 2nd of 2022 at 1, is that the one we are likely not going to need now, Matt?
That's right. The next meeting that we had set up, we have accomplished everything that we needed to in this meeting. So I want to thank everybody for the hard work, the review of the applications that was done in preparation for today. I think it really helped to streamline the discussion. And again, looking forward to the upcoming strategic planning so that we can hash through some of these other issues that that were brought up today.
Yeah, and
I
I guess
just
I
want-
will. You, Michael, I think
Yeah.
you're going to say what I was going to say. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Oh my goodness, I just have to say that in my time as a commissioner, which is not nearly as long as almost all of you, I just think it's been impressive the way the progress is from year to year. It's remarkable. It's truly remarkable, and makes me just, you know, really proud to be part of the group to see how progress is made so rapidly. I mean, I wish all of government could be like this. So thank you so much to every single one of you who are staff who work on this so much with your devotion. We don't always get to see you day to day, but you are truly good at what you do. It's pretty amazing, and just a great group of commissioners as well. Michael?
I was just going to say the staff has done an amazing job on this. This is as smooth as it's ever gone.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So,
Wow. Well, very good. If there's not any other comment, I'm sure we can look. I think there have been other calendar invites that have gone out so people can kind of plan the rest of the year, and sure appreciate every one of you who's made time to do this.
Madam Chair, may I make a motion to adjourn?
Ryan, you're always the best at remembering that. So,
Second.
all right, Ryan and Mary, thank you for making it right to the end.
And you don't need to vote on that one. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
so much.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
thank you.
Okay, see you later. Bye-bye.
Is the coast clear?
Can we pause our recording
Oh, fine.
or end our recording?